Okay. So in today's session, occupational therapist Natalie Piwinski will delve more into sensory processing, sensory versus behavior, and sensory strategies. She will discuss sensory versus behavior challenges and provide sensory strategies to support those with WSS. Natalie is a Sacramento, California native who attended college at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and earned her Master's of OT from Dominican University. She has been working as an OT in the pediatric space. If you'll give me one moment. Natalie is going to share a bit more today. She is going to tell us a bit more about herself, some of the experiences she's had, and some of the experiences she's had with children with WSS as well as others. So please allow me to introduce Natalie, and Natalie, the stage is all yours.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Crystal, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming and for having me here. I feel very honored to be here today and to present this information to all of you. So first of all, yes, I'm going to be talking about sensory processing in children. I'm sure, we'll kind of get into it a little bit later. I'm sure it's something, a phrase that you all have heard, just having kids nowadays. Before I want to kind of expand a little bit about me and kind of how I got here. So I'm an occupational therapist. I work at a pediatric clinic called Capital Kids in Sacramento. And I got my master's degree from Dominican University, which is also in California, my bachelor's from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I started in child development, so I've always had a deep passion for working with children. And it's been, and then my road kind of led me to occupational therapy, which I'm very grateful for. I completed my graduate capstone research on an emerging evaluation protocol, which is now being used called the SOCI, or the Structured Observation of Sensory Integration and Motor Function. So during this capstone is really where I learned a lot about sensory processing, sensory integration, and it really formed my interest in this particular, context within occupational therapy. And so that's kind of the background of how I got started in sensory processing. And then currently I'm a fieldwork instructor, a mentor, and I teach summer skills labs at the University of Pacific here in California. They have a doctorate program for occupational therapy, so I get to be a part of that. And then I also developed and pioneered an outdoor OT camp, which I piloted this last summer. I got to shadow one that was done in Marin County. And then I moved to Sacramento, which is where I'm originally from. And I decided to start it there because I was very passionate about it. And I believe that the outside and the outdoors is the best environment for developing and integrating sensory and motor skills. And so, that's kind of how I got asked to be here today. One of my campers' parents is a part of the WSS Foundation, and they asked me to speak today. And so, I'm very happy to be here. So that's just a little bit more about me. But now we'll get into, I just kind of wanted to talk about what pediatric OT is. I'm not sure if any of your children have attended OT or not, but I just kind of wanted to give a background of, why we care about sensory processing. So pediatric OT helps children improve self-care skills. Self-care skills are, brushing your teeth, tying your shoes, zipping your jacket, just the things that they need to be able to do every single day. And then school-based skills as well. So we also work in the school. So that's cutting, handwriting, those type of things. We work on addressing sensory challenges, which I'll get into more detail later, and then works on emotional regulation and social skills. So we work on a wide variety of things, and our main goal is to try and improve the independence of the daily activities at home. So we address all these different things in order to improve independence as much as possible at home, at school, and in the community. So so sensory processing, like I said, this term is used a lot nowadays. It's kind of thrown out there, but I think having a deeper understanding of what exactly it means and how it impacts, all of us every single day can really help us understand, our kids and understand just kind of what's going on. So sensory processing, what is it? It's the process of how an individual takes in information, so from the body and from the environment, via your senses. So we'll have a little review of what our senses are, but and so you take in the information, you're interpreting the information, so you're trying to understand what's really going on, you're organizing the information, and then you're producing an output, so a response, you're reacting to the input. And then you're taking that in order to use it to participate in everyday activities, whether that's soccer, whether that's playing outside with friends, whether that's your self-care skills that you're doing at home. You need to have efficient sensory processing in order to do them on your own. So now we're going to break it down just a little bit further. So we're kind of going to start from the very beginning. So what are our five senses? I know you all are familiar with these, but we're going to start with sight. So vision, it's processed through, your eyes, obviously, visual receptors that are located in your eyes. And it's typically stimulated by light, color, or movement in the environment. So for example, if something's running at you really fast, you're going to see that, you're going to interpret that information and organize and maybe move out of the way, right? Because you're seeing, oh, this person's coming towards me or this thing's coming towards me, so I'm going to move out of the way. So that's, the way that your body is, or your brain is processing that input, right? So then we have sound or hearing. So this is through the auditory sense. Auditory receptors are located in your inner ear, and they identify, how loud a noise is, how high, low, far, where the noise is. So an alarm sound, right, is really loud and really intense. And so that kind of alerts us to, oh, okay, something might be going on here, something that I need to pay attention to. So again, all of these you're interpreting, organizing, and responding. So then touch is processed through the tactile sense. These are receptors all over your body, your skin. And the most receptors are in your mouth. So that's why when we're younger, we put a lot of things in our mouth to kind of understand our environment. But a great example for touch is a hot stove. So when you touch it, that interpretation of what's going on, and then it's telling your hand to get off of the stove, right? Because that's pain and pressure and temperature, all the things that are being interpreted through the sense of touch. And then we have taste. So, people have different things that they like or dislike based off the receptors in their mouths, but it can pick up sweet, sour, bitter, salty, spicy. And another thing is like crunchy or soft, like we interpret that all through the receptors in our mouth. So, and then smell. So smell and taste are really related. They're really linked. So typically things that don't smell good, we don't really want to eat, right? So but smell is processed through olfactory receptors located in your nose. It can distinguish between a range of smells like flowery and musty, and yeah. So now we'll kind of get into some senses that maybe you haven't heard about before, or maybe you have. But there's 3 more senses. So I know we're always taught we have 5 senses, but there's actually 8. So we're going to talk about 3 of those today. One of them is, the first one that we're going to review is called the vestibular sense. So this is through the vestibular system. This system has receptors in your inner ear, and it detects where your head is in relation to the rest of your body as you move through space. So that girl on the swing right there, her head, or the receptors in her inner ear are helping her head to stay upright in relation to the rest of her body as she's moving through space, right? So swinging is one of the main ways that we activate the vestibular system, get it alert and awake, and get it working. So that's the vestibular system. The proprioceptive system is you receive it through your muscles in your joints. So it helps in understanding body awareness, understanding spatial relations, so where you are in relation to somebody else or something else. So an example of that is, stepping onto a curb. When you step up onto a curb, you are getting information from your muscles in your joints that, oh, my foot is on the curb now, right? And then I can continue to step. So it's kind of happening subconsciously, but you're constantly using your proprioceptive system. And then we have our interoception system. So this is processing signals from your body and sending it to your brain. So, letting you know that you're hungry, letting you know that you need to go to the bathroom, your heart beating, that are constantly in communication, breathing. So these are all going on inside your body and talking to your brain. And it's a sensory system that's being used all the time. And then, okay, so sensory processing disorder. So this is also a term that I think can sometimes be thrown around a lot. And so I kind of wanted to just address it and dive into it. So sensory processing disorder is not something that an OT or anyone can currently diagnose. So it's not in the diagnostic manual. So but it is widely accepted that there are sensory processing difficulties that can impact somebody's life and somebody's daily activities. And so, and there's ongoing research within the sensory processing community and OT community to have sensory processing disorder become a diagnosis. And so there's a lot of effort there to have that happen. But sensory processing disorder is often connected to other neurological conditions. So it's closely linked to autism. And there's a lot of research behind that. But it can occur on its own. So someone can have sensory processing difficulties, challenges that we can classify under sensory processing disorder without having another, diagnosis. So what is sensory processing disorder? It impacts the way the brain takes in, processes, and responds to that input. So that loop that I was talking about of communication, sometimes there can be like a traffic jam. So it just prevents that sensory information from reaching the areas it's supposed to, or reaching them in an efficient and timely way. So then it can impact the response to that input, right? So, we'll get into the different kinds of sensory processing disorder, but it can impact any of the senses or all of them. So, or just one. So it really varies depending on the person. And so, as you all know, WSS is under research, but so we don't currently know the statistics, linking sensory processing disorder and WSS, but it's this is what I tell all parents, no matter what, but it's important just to have an understanding of sensory processing and sensory processing, difficulties or challenges and what that might look like, so that you can do things at home, and I'll go into what you can do and what it could potentially look like in just a moment. Okay, so as adults, right, like we've grown to understand ourselves and our bodies, and we know what we can and can't tolerate, what does and doesn't feel good. And we also have the language and the life experience and coping skills to be able to deal with it the best we know how, right? And so children don't often have as much autonomy. And so this can lead to certain behaviors. And so we sometimes can be like, oh, we're upset because I'm hungry, right? But that connection maybe isn't always there for a lot of kids, no matter a diagnosis or not. So, but sensory processing disorder is more, it affects the daily life of a child. So these are different categories within sensory processing disorder. So there's over and under responsive. So over responsive is that someone who is over responsive to sensory input often has difficulty in selecting and attending to important input in the environment. So filtering out background noise, they're very aware of all the sounds in the environment, maybe scared of like vacuums, loud noises, things like that. Or defensiveness to certain textures, so maybe a picky eater, but to the point where it's impacting, like only eating a certain type of food or amount of food, maybe defensive to certain textures, covering ears in response to noises, and then distractibility. And sometimes this can even be avoidance, so hiding from certain noises or not wanting to be in crowds of people where people are in their space or something like that. So that's kind of how over responsiveness looks. And then under responsive, so this is the opposite. So they're not able to pick up as much sensory information. So sometimes they might seem disengaged or disinterested, but it's really that they're just not being able to pick up on what's going on. It's not, the sensory processing isn't happening as efficiently as maybe would be ideal. And so it's taking a long time, slow processing of information, things like that. So another form of under-responsiveness is sensory seeking. So this is actually, there is an under-response. So the reaction is actually to seek out everything because they have a really, high threshold for the input that they need. So frequently fidgeting or seeking out movement, constantly touching people or objects, making loud noises themselves, enjoying rough and tumble play to the point where it seems dangerous, maybe high tolerance for pain, constantly chewing on clothing or non-food items, that type of stuff. So those are all more like behavior-based type of categories for sensory processing disorder. Kind of what does the behavior look like, and then we kind of go into the meaning behind all of that, depending on the kid, because this can all be it can kind of look different for each child. So that's kind of more the behavior-based, and now we'll go into the motor-based. So these are more motor-based disorders within the umbrella of sensory processing disorder. So sensory discrimination disorder is basically just difficulty and confusion about the source of the sensation. So it can look like clumsiness, trouble noticing hunger, difficulty, knowing where you are in space. So it's just hard to differentiate between the certain sensory systems for sensory discrimination disorder. For postural disorder, this typically demonstrates as, limited core strength, low tone, poor balance and body awareness, preferring sedentary activities just because sometimes simple, seemingly simple forms of movement can take extra concentration. It can be a little bit harder. So, just moving on uneven surfaces, for example, can be a little bit more difficult, like bumpy ground or rocky ground. So that's something to note for postural disorders. And then the last one is dyspraxia. So this is difficulty with motor planning. So, kicking a ball, catching a ball, working both sides of the body together can be a little bit difficult. And then difficulties with ideation. So ideation is basically the brain's ability to conceive a sequence of unfamiliar actions. So if someone is like, you could do this and then do this and then do this, gives them instructions, a motor instruction, it's hard to sequence that. And it's hard to, have a variety of play ideas. Sometimes, someone with dyspraxia likes to do the same thing over and over again because that's something that they're comfortable with and familiar with and kind of have down. But a new motor skill can be hard to learn. So those are all the different forms of sensory processing disorder, which is why it can be really complicated and a little bit overwhelming. But of course, at the end, I'll ask any questions. But just to note, someone can have difficulties in this area and difficulties in this area. It doesn't always look as, no one's in a box, right? It's not always like this is the one issue that they have. So sometimes they can have, difficulties with dyspraxia, but also be, a little bit, have some like defensiveness to tactile input, let's say, or something, be a little bit over responsive. So you can see behaviors or function or in both. So yeah, just wanted to address that because sometimes I get that question a lot. But now for sensory versus behavior. So another question I get asked a lot as a therapist is how can I tell the difference between, my child having a sensory challenge or difficulty versus my child having, a behavior or a tantrum? Like, how can I tell the difference? And, what I tell everyone is, it could be both, which isn't always the ideal answer. But sometimes a learned response could start as, it could be a response to a sensory input that is not wanted. And then what we all learn, right, is, oh, okay, that will stay away. I don't have to deal with it. So then it might end up being a learned behavior of, oh, if I react this way, then I don't have to do the thing that I don't want to do, or that makes me uncomfortable. So it eventually can be a little bit hard to distinguish between the two. If you do have a child that is has some over responsiveness going on from a sensory perspective. But how I break it down is, if it's more of a sensory related challenge or difficulty going on, usually it's a reaction to a stimulus. So a particular stimulus might cause like crying or running away. Some of those behaviors, the child typically might not care if people are paying attention or looking at them or whatever. They're kind of like, they're upset and they're worried, and it doesn't matter, who's looking, who's watching. Also might take longer to regulate, to calm down, might require some help. And And also, typically, what we see from a sensory overwhelm perspective is a fight or flight response. So that's, dilated pupils, sweating, red ears. Sometimes, if it's, a food or something, there might be some gagging going on or something like that. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of activated. So that's your fight or flight, right? And so, like I was talking about previously, your senses are kind of taking in information to protect us at all times. And so sometimes that can be, the communication can be, oh, this thing is a threat, even though, we know as adults it's not. A child can interpret something as a threat. And that is something, that we want to respect and take seriously. So yeah, that fight or flight response is typically what we see from a sensory overwhelm perspective. And then from behavior, so usually, if it's more behavior, it's more driven by a want or a goal. They might check, or your child might check to make sure you're looking at them, or maybe when they attain what you think they want, the behavior stops. And then there's no immediate autonomic response. There might be crying and tears to the point where it creates an autonomic response, but that's not the initial reaction to whatever it may be. So again, just keeping in mind that it could be both, and sometimes it's hard to decipher between the two for anyone, for parents, for OTs, for teachers. It can be hard, and if you don't see everything from the beginning, it can be difficult to distinguish. But again, all behavior is a form of communication. So just trying to understand like what they're trying to tell you, if possible. So and then occupational therapy's role. So I just briefly wanted to touch on, what do we do about it as OTs? So we would first do an assessment in sensory motor development and function. Then, depending on the results of that, we would create functional goals with family guidance. So, what are goals that you want as a family, or what are daily life activities that you would want your child to be able to engage in as fully as possible. And so treatments include, graded exposure to non-preferred sensory stimuli, if that's something that we find important, to build tolerance and form appropriate responses. Parent and family education is huge, especially when it comes to sensory processing. And then creation and implementation of sensory strategies. We used to use the word sensory diet, and now we've kind of transitioned to sensory lifestyle, because we think it's important to make it more of like a embedded type of activity in everyone's daily life, us included, even adults. So, and then implementation of emotional regulation protocol, if we feel that's necessary. So zones and alert program are just two examples. And then if necessary, there's also a sensory-based feeding program called the SOS feeding program. And if there's, particular needs regarding feeding. Okay, so examples of sensory strategies. So these are just some ideas that you can implement at home and try to incorporate into your daily routine as much as possible. Like I said, sensory diets are very particular to each child. So it does vary, but these are things that really can be good for everybody. So heavy work. So heavy work is really targeting the proprioceptive system. So pushing, pulling, crashing. Proprioception just helps so much with body awareness, helps with motor skills. So some examples, right? Like heavy groceries, having your kid help you having your child help you carry heavy groceries in, having them push and move furniture, around to make like a place where they can crash and jump or something. So just having them help as much as possible to create, these fun activities can get them input as well. So, and then breaking down tasks in a smaller part. So, for example, when completing a task, like let's just take shoe tying, having them, if they have difficulty tying shoes, having them just complete the last step, so that they feel successful, they feel confident in that, and then kind of going back from there. And then you have that once they accomplish the last step, then you have them complete the last 2 steps, then the last 3 steps, so that you're breaking it down into smaller chunks, but you always want to try to, as much as you can, have them feel successful in it, because then they're going to be more motivated to do it on their own. And so, shoe tying is one example, but you can do that for a variety of activities that might be particularly, difficult. And then encouraging spinning and jumping. Sometimes I'll see kids start spinning and, someone will be like, oh, stop spinning, you're going to get dizzy. But oftentimes if a kid is spinning, it's because they need it. So encouraging spinning, obviously with breaks and things. And a trick I tell all parents is if your kid's dizzy, if you push down on your head, it's actually proprioceptive input into your head, right? Telling you where you are in space. I call it the dizzy trick, and I use it a lot during my sessions. So that's just something to note. But encouraging spinning and jumping where you can, where it's safe, to get that input. And then I always follow it up with deep touch pressure. So pillow sandwiches, taking 2 pillows and doing deep squeezes, or even crashing is good. It's a little bit more alerting than deep touch pressure, but something simple, something easy, something that you can do, even just squeezes on the shoulder or head pushes. Those are all types of deep touch pressure that can be really, really helpful in just regulating and calming the nervous system after engaging in, jumping, crashing, spinning, things that are a little bit more alerting. And then deep breathing. So having, deep breathing aids in regulation, helps calm the nervous system. So bubbles is a huge deep breathing activity that I do all the time. And everyone loves bubbles. It makes everyone happy. So, and then also, having a quiet corner if possible. So trying to create some type of fort with, a sheet or something, limiting light, limiting visuals, and just having like a book in there and a weighted blanket if that's, appropriate. Just a space where, it's not like a timeout area. It's more just, hey, here's an area where you can kind of get away and have some quiet time if that's something that you want. And this is something that I suggest to a lot of schools if it's possible, because I find that it can be really helpful, because we're constantly bombarded with sensory stimulation, all of us. And then encourage play with food. So, I know we were all told growing up, don't play with your food. But if you do have a kid that's an avoider or doesn't really like very many, textures or has a limited food repertoire, encouraging play with food. So, like making slime, but adding like cornstarch in there or some material that's maybe a little bit different. But encouraging play with food, even at the dinner table, as silly as it sounds, can be helpful in just getting them interested, maybe reducing the anxiety that might be there surrounding food sometimes. So those are just examples of sensory strategies. There are a lot more out there, but these are ones that I feel like can apply to most people. And then here's some sensory processing in literature. So this is just kind of the connection. These are some studies that were done on sensory processing and intellectual disability, sensory processing disorder, and ADHD and autism. And then there's some outdoor OT research that's done on the connection to why outdoor play is so beneficial for kids. But I'll get into that in a little bit. And then here's some resources. So if you suspect, sensory processing difficulties or motor challenges, working with a pediatrician to find a local OT, seeking early intervention services if your child's under 3, and then OT at school can be really helpful for children over 3. And then, I have on here some web-based resources. So the SOS feeding approach, the Sensory Processing Disorder Foundation website, the STAR Institute, which is a great institute that addresses sensory processing disorder. I linked the symptoms checklist on there, just as something that if you are interested, you could check out. And then Capital Kids Place, where I work, because there's a bunch of cool stuff on there too. And then sensory motor fun at home. So motor planning skills and multi-step craft ideas, OT plan. They also have a bunch of like sensory type of activities that are fun. And then a couple recommended books. So The Out of Sync Child and then Sensational Kids are both awesome books that give much more detail about sensory processing disorder. And then Balanced and Barefoot, which is a book about outdoor OT and just outdoor play in general and why it's so beneficial. And I highly, highly recommend it. It's a very, very good book. And then this is my own personal plug on outdoor OT, outdoor play, and why it's so important. So outdoor play, helps with movement and exploration in a natural setting. It gets them outside, in subdued color and lighting. There's not as much sensory overload. it's a nice break from, like I was saying, the sensory stimulation that all of us get, all day. And, it's also a great opportunity to practice flexibility, because so much is out of our control outside. Getting muddy, different textures, the weather not going your way, a trail being a little bit difficult or being closed maybe. So we're constantly having to adapt to our surroundings, keeping our minds flexible, dealing with changes, that type of thing. And then also going outside and being in the natural environment, climbing trees, walking on logs, creating an obstacle course from rocks to logs to, all that. It helps and it encourages children to move in a variety of positions. And I know, a lot of kids do, sports. I grew up doing sports. Sports are great. It gets our bodies moving, but it's kind of the same movement and it's repetitive, and there's certain motor skills that are expected of you. But outside, it really allows imagination to flourish, and it allows, the children to kind of lead the activity and lead the play, lead what they're interested in, and move their bodies in ways that they don't typically get, during their day or in sports. And ultimately, we all, and children especially, learn through their senses. So it makes them, engage in activities that are, using all of their senses versus just one or two at a time when you're sitting at a desk, right? So it's amazing. And then the main thing is unstructured play, which is basically, providing materials, for example, like providing a bunch of sticks and then being like, okay, what should we do with them? Because it helps creativity. It helps, it helps them kind of come up with their ideas. It helps build confidence. It's awesome. And it's been awesome to run these programs and kind of see these kids flourish. And it's just, it's been really great. So I know, weather permitting, depending on what state you're in, but dress appropriately for the weather and try and get outside. That's just my last little plug. And then these are some references, and I think it's time for Q&A.
Thank you, Natalie. That was a very thorough explanation and probably the best one I've heard in the 14 years I've been working with my own child. Sensory processing. So at this time, I'm going to end our recording. So if you have questions, you can feel comfortable asking those. You can come off mute and share your questions, or if you'd like to put those in the chat, please do so. So I will